The Boeing 777's cabin lights flickered twice before failing completely. In the darkness, 400 passengers felt the aircraft shudder, not turbulence, but something mechanical, something wrong. The intercom crackled to life with a voice that tried too hard to sound calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a situation. If there are any military pilots aboard, particularly anyone with fighter or tactical aircraft experience, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." In row 10, seat C, Major Rebecca Phantom Voss stirred from an uneasy sleep. Her weathered flight jacket, the one she'd worn through 3 combat tours, served as her pillow against the window. At 43, she looked younger despite the silver threading through her dark hair, pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for 20 years of service. The passengers around her were already murmuring, looking for heroes in business suits or young men with military haircuts. Nobody noticed the woman in faded jeans and an old Pearl Jam t-shirt slowly sitting up, her movements deliberate, controlled. She'd been dreaming of Afghanistan again, the Hindu Kush mountains rising like teeth beneath her F-16's wings, the weight of decisions that cost lives, saved lives, changed lives. The dream always ended the same way, with the sound of her wingman's last transmission before the SAM hit. Now awake, she heard a different kind of fear in the captain's voice, buried beneath his professional composure. The flight attendant rushed past, her face pale in the emergency lighting. "Did anyone respond?" another passenger asked loudly. "We need a pilot." The man in 9B turned around, investment banker type, Rolex catching what little light remained. "My brother flies Cessnas," he offered helpfully. "Maybe." "Ma'am." The flight attendant had stopped at row 10, but she was addressing the elderly woman in 10A. "Were you raising your hand?" Rebecca stood slowly, her joints protesting after 4 hours of cramped sleep. "I was." Her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people stop talking. The investment banker actually laughed. "You're kidding, right? You fly fighters." He looked her up and down, taking in the concert t-shirt, the lack of makeup, the wedding ring she still wore despite the divorce papers signed 8 months ago. The flight attendant hesitated, sharing his skepticism. Rebecca reached into her jacket pocket and produced a worn military ID. "Major Rebecca Voss, United States Air Force. 4,000 hours in F-16s, another 2,000 in various tactical aircraft." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "And before you ask, yes, I can fly this thing if I have to. But I'm hopping your captain just needs someone who speaks airplane." The silence that followed was broken by another shudder running through the aircraft's frame. This time, everyone felt it. The investment banker's smile faded. The flight attendant grabbed Rebecca's arm. "Please, come with me, quickly." Rebecca followed her toward the cockpit, her mind already cycling through possibilities. Hydraulic failure, electrical malfunction, structural damage. Behind her, she heard whispers spreading through the cabin like wildfire. "Did she say F-16s? That woman's a fighter pilot. She doesn't look like." The voices faded as she approached the reinforced cockpit door, where the co-pilot waited with an expression that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't a minor malfunction. This was the kind of situation that would either make the news as a miraculous landing or not make the news at all. The cockpit door sealed behind her with a soft hiss. Through the windscreen, she could see the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly below, black as her old nightmares. The captain turned in his seat, mid-50s, gray-haired, the kind of steady presence airlines put in recruitment posters. But his hands were trembling slightly on the yoke. "Major Voss, thank God. We've lost primary hydraulics, backups failing, and we're 800 miles from the nearest suitable runway." He gestured to the instrument panel, where warning lights painted the cockpit in reds and ambers. "I've got 30 years of commercial flying, but this is combat-level problem-solving." Rebecca slipped into the jump seat behind them, her trained eyes scanning the instruments in seconds. The aircraft was dying a slow death, bleeding hydraulic fluid into the night sky. In her F-16, she'd have ejected by now. But there were no ejection seats for 400 souls, no parachutes for families returning from vacations, business travelers, the young couple she'd noticed boarding with their newborn. She thought of her own daughter, safe at Georgetown University, probably asleep in her dorm room, unaware that her mother was once again in a cockpit where death was measured in minutes and decisions. "Show me your hydraulic pressure readings," she said, leaning forward. The co-pilot, younger, nervous, pulled up the display. The numbers were worse than she'd expected. "You're losing fluid faster than the backup can compensate. At this rate, you've got maybe 40 minutes before you lose all control authority." The captain's jaw tightened. "The company wants us to try for Gander." Rebecca shook her head. "You'll never make it, and even if you do, you won't have enough control for a conventional landing." "Then what do you suggest, Major?" There was no sarcasm in his voice now, only the desperation of a man watching his options disappear. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the aircraft's rhythm through her feet, through the seat. Every aircraft spoke its own language of vibrations and sounds. This one was whispering about its death. "We need to get creative," she said, opening her eyes. "In combat, when you can't fly normally, you fly abnormally. Use what works to compensate for what doesn't." She pointed to the engine throttles. "Differential thrust for turning, trim for pitch control. It'll be like flying a very expensive, very heavy glider with occasional spurts of directional control." The co-pilot stared at her. "That's insane. This isn't a fighter jet. It's a 777 with 400 people on board." "Which is why we're going to make it work," Rebecca replied. Her voice carried no doubt, even though her mind was calculating odds she didn't like. "Captain, I need you to declare an emergency with ATC. Tell them we need vectors to the closest runway, any runway over 8,000 feet, military fields included." She turned to the co-pilot. "You're going to help me jury-rig a control system using what we have left, and both of you need to understand something." She met their eyes in turn. "I've brought damaged aircraft home before. We're going to get these people on the ground." The captain reached for his radio, his movement steadier now. Having a plan, even an insane one, was better than feeling helpless. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. United Flight 447 declaring an emergency. Major hydraulic failure, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable field." The response crackled back immediately, professional voices hiding their own fear as they began clearing airspace for a dying aircraft. Rebecca pulled off her wedding ring and zipped it into her jacket pocket. Old habit from combat, no distractions, nothing that could catch on controls. The co-pilot noticed and misunderstood. "Family waiting for you." "Daughter," Rebecca said shortly, already calculating descent rates and approach speeds. "She's 19, wants to be a doctor, not a pilot." She didn't mention the 6 years of missed birthdays, the marriage that couldn't survive the deployments, the nights she'd chosen the squadron over soccer games. Those were debts she'd been trying to repay in retirement, one quiet civilian flight at a time. Until tonight. Atlantic Control came back with coordinates: Halifax, Nova Scotia, 470 miles. At their current rate of degradation, it would be close. Beyond close, Rebecca stood, shrugging off her jacket. "All right, gentlemen, time to see if commercial aviation can learn some fighter pilot tricks. Captain, I need you to gradually reduce speed to minimum controllable airspeed. We need to conserve every drop of hydraulic fluid." She moved between them, pointing at instruments. "Co-pilot, what's your name?" James Mitchell." He was maybe 30, probably had a perfect safety record, probably never imagined he'd be in a cockpit where the next hour determined whether 400 people lived or died. "James, you're going to be my hands on the throttles. When I call for differential thrust, you give it to me immediately. No hesitation." "But the engines aren't designed for," Rebecca cut him off. "Tonight they are. Tonight everything on this aircraft is whatever we need it to be." She turned back to the captain. "Sir, you're going to maintain pitch with electric trim. It'll be sluggish, but it works. Think of it like flying through molasses. Every input needs to be anticipated, not reactive." The plane shuddered again, this time with a grinding sound that made all three of them freeze. Another hydraulic line giving way. The captain's voice was steady as he reported to ATC, but Rebecca saw his knuckles white on the yoke. In the cabin behind them, 400 people sat in darkness, trusting in the thin aluminum walls and the skill of strangers to keep them alive. Some would be praying. Some would be texting loved ones, just in case. Some, like she had been an hour ago, would be sleeping, unaware that death was courting them at 37,000 feet. "We need to descend," Rebecca said. "The lower altitude will reduce stress on the airframe. Captain, begin a very gradual descent, no more than 500 feet per minute." As he complied, she noticed something, a St. Christopher pendant hanging from his neck, catching the instrument lights. Her own father had worn one back when he flew B-52s over Vietnam. He died in his bed at 90, but he always said the medal had brought him home from 13 combat missions. She wondered if it worked for commercial flights, hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid over the North Atlantic. The descent was rough, the aircraft wallowing like a drunk whale without proper control surfaces. In the cabin, oxygen masks hadn't deployed. This wasn't that kind of emergency. This was the slow kind, the insidious kind, where death crept in through failing systems rather than explosive decompression. Rebecca preferred the quick emergencies, the ones where training kicked in and time compressed, and you either lived or died based on split-second decisions. This was torture, watching failure approach in slow motion, knowing that every passing minute reduced their chances. "Major," James said suddenly, staring at his instruments, "we're losing hydraulic pressure faster. The backup system is failing." Rebecca looked at the gauges. He was right. They had minutes, not the hour she'd hoped for. Halifax was still 300 miles away. The math was simple and merciless. They wouldn't make it, not conventionally. She thought of her daughter again, of the last text she'd sent before boarding, flying to London for the conference. "Love you." Such ordinary last words. Then she thought of her training, of impossible situations in Afghan skis, of her instructor's voice from 20 years ago. "When you can't win by the rules, change the game." "We're not going to Halifax," she announced. Both pilots turned to stare at her. "There's a closer option. I need a military field or a long straight highway, something within 100 miles. The captain's eyes widened. "You want to land a 777 on a highway?" "I want to land a 777 anywhere we can walk away from," Rebecca corrected. "James, get on the radio, find out what's below us. Everything, military installations, closed airports, even drag strips. Anything with a straight, flat surface." As James frantically worked the radio, Rebecca did the math she didn't want to do. The rate of hydraulic loss, the distance to any possible landing site, the minimum control speed without hydraulics. The numbers didn't lie. They had one shot at this, and it would require flying this massive commercial airliner like a fighter jet running on fumes and prayers. "There," James pointed at his chart display. "Abandoned military field 60 miles northeast. Used to be a strategic air command base. Runway still there, 12,000 feet of concrete." Rebecca leaned over to look. "Perfect. SAC bases were built for bombers carrying nuclear weapons. Their runways were massive, over-engineered monuments to Cold War paranoia. That's our target. Captain, turn northeast. Use differential thrust, left engine to 70%, right engine to 30%. The aircraft began a slow, wallowing turn. In the cabin, passengers would be feeling the unusual motion, the wrong sensation of turning without banking properly. Fear would be spreading, that contagious terror that came when people realized something was very wrong with their aircraft. Rebecca had felt it before, in a C-130 over Kandahar with 2 engines out and Taliban rockets rising to meet them. The fear never went away. You just learned to work through it, to make it fuel instead of paralysis. "United 447, be advised," ATC called. "That field has been closed for 8 years. No emergency equipment, no lighting, no navigational aids." Rebecca took the radio. "Atlantic Control, this is Major Rebecca Voss, U.S. Air Force, assisting United 447. We have critical hydraulic failure and limited control authority. We need that field. Request you contact any military assets in the area for emergency response." There was a pause. She could imagine controllers looking at each other, realizing this wasn't a standard emergency anymore. "Roger, United 447. We're coordinating with military authorities. Squawk 7700 and proceed as required. The transponder code for emergency. On radar screens across the northeastern seaboard, their blip would now be flashing, screaming its distress to anyone watching. 40 miles, James reported, his voice tight. Rebecca checked the hydraulic pressure. They were flying on vapor now, each control input potentially the last one that would work. The aircraft was becoming a ballistic object, subject to physics rather than pilot control. "Start dumping fuel," she ordered. "We need to be as light as possible." The captain hesitated. "That's going to panic the passengers." "They're already panicked," Rebecca said bluntly. "But they'll be alive to complain about it later." The captain nodded, reaching for the fuel dump switches. Outside, twin streams of jet fuel began venting into the night, creating contrails that would be visible for miles. To anyone watching from below, it would look like the aircraft was bleeding into the sky. "Major Voss," the captain said quietly, "I need to ask, have you ever done anything like this before?" Rebecca allowed herself a tight smile. "No one's ever done this before, not in a 777, but I've done impossible before." She thought of the day she'd earned her call sign, Phantom, for disappearing into a canyon system to evade 6 enemy fighters, then reappearing to splash 2 of them before they knew she'd reversed course. The aircraft doesn't know it's impossible, it just knows physics. And physics, Captain, is the same whether you're flying an F-16 or a flying building. 20 miles. The abandoned base should be visible soon, except they were flying through cloud cover now, blind to the ground below. The weather radar showed clear air ahead, but that didn't help if they couldn't see the runway until the last moment. "James, we need to get below this cloud deck." "Captain, idle thrust on both engines. We're going to glide." "Glide?" James's voice cracked slightly. "This thing doesn't glide, it falls with style." Rebecca almost laughed. He was quoting Toy Story, probably unconsciously. "Then we fall with style, but we control the fall." The engines spooled down to idle, and the massive aircraft began to descend more rapidly. Without hydraulics, it was like riding a shopping cart down a hill, technically moving forward but barely under control. The clouds parted at 8,000 feet, and there it was, a scar of concrete in the darkness, barely visible except for the different texture it made against the surrounding forest. No lights, no markings, just a strip of abandonment that might save 400 lives. "I see it," the captain breathed. "God help us, I see it." "God helps those who help themselves," Rebecca replied, her father's favorite saying. "Captain, you're going to have to time this perfectly. We get one approach. No go-arounds, no second chances." She turned to James. "On my mark, you're going to use asymmetric thrust to line us up. It'll be rough, but it'll work." The abandoned runway grew larger in the windscreen. Rebecca could see the cracks in the concrete, the places where nature had begun to reclaim human ambition. It would have to be enough. In her mind, she was calculating. Approach speed, sink rate, the precise moment when physics would either forgive or condemn them. Behind her, 400 people sat in darkness, their fate in the hands of 3 pilots trying to make a dying aircraft do the impossible. 5 miles, James called out. "Hydraulic pressure is critical. We're losing." A loud bang cut him off. The last hydraulic line had failed. The control yoke went dead in the captain's hands. They were now flying purely on engine thrust and hope. Rebecca's voice remained calm even as her heart rate spiked. "Differential thrust only. James, left engine to flight idle, right engine to 40%. Now." The aircraft began to turn slowly, ponderously, like a ship without a rudder. The runway slid into alignment, not perfectly, but close enough. Right engine to idle, left to 40. The turn stopped. They were lined up, more or less, with less than 2 miles to go. "Captain, electric trim full nose up. We need to flare without elevators." "This is insane," he muttered, but his hands moved to comply. The nose began to rise slightly, fighting gravity with the last working system on the aircraft. Rebecca watched the radar altimeter, 1,000 feet, 800, 600. The runway rushed toward them, a promise of solid ground that might come too fast, too hard. "All engines to idle," she commanded. We're going to plant this thing on the numbers and pray the brakes work." The engines wound down, and suddenly the cockpit was almost quiet, just the wind rushing past and the groaning of an airframe pushed beyond its design limits. 400 feet, 200, 100. "Brace, brace, brace," the captain called over the intercom. Throughout the cabin, people assumed crash positions, parents holding children, strangers reaching for strangers' hands. In the cockpit, Rebecca gripped the back of both pilots' seats, her eyes fixed on the approaching concrete. 50 feet, 20, 10. The main landing gear touched with a shriek of protesting metal. Without hydraulic shock absorbers, the impact was brutal, rattling through the entire aircraft. The nose gear slammed down a second later, and suddenly they were rolling, fast, too fast, using up precious runway with only wheel brakes to slow them. The captain stood on the brakes, James deployed the thrust reversers, and Rebecca watched the runway markers flash past, counting down the distance to the overrun. 8,000 feet remaining. 6,000, 4,000. The aircraft was slowing, but not fast enough. At the end of the runway, forest waited, dark, dense, unforgiving. 2,000 feet. 1,000. The brakes were smoking now, she could smell it. 500 feet. They stopped with less than 200 feet of runway remaining. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the spinning down of engines and the tick of cooling metal. Then the captain's voice, hoarse but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground. Please remain seated until we secure the aircraft." The cockpit erupted in exhausted celebration, James laughing hysterically, the captain slumping in his seat with relief. Rebecca stood quietly, looking out at the darkness beyond the runway. They'd done it. 400 people would go home to their families. Her daughter would not get a phone call that would shatter her world. But her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up. "Major Voss," the captain said, turning to look at her. "I've been flying for 30 years. What you just did, what you just taught us to do, there's no manual for that, no procedure. That was pure instinct and experience." Rebecca shrugged, suddenly feeling every one of her 43 years. "That was 20 years of combat flying applied to a situation I never trained for. Sometimes that's all we have, taking what we know and adapting it to what we face." Emergency slides deployed and the evacuation began. Rebecca stayed in the cockpit, helping coordinate with the military helicopters that were already approaching. Someone at ATC had done their job well. She watched passengers sliding down into the night, some crying, some laughing, all alive. The investment banker from 9B was one of the last to leave. He paused at the cockpit door, which stood open now. "Major," he said, and she could see the shame in his eyes. "I'm sorry for laughing earlier, for doubting." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "You saw a middle-aged woman in a concert t-shirt, I get it. People see what they expect to see." He shook his head. "No, that's not an excuse. You saved our lives, all of us." After he left, Rebecca finally allowed herself to sit down in the captain's seat. Through the windscreen, she could see the first helicopters landing, their searchlights turning the abandoned base into a landing zone from her past. How many times had she sat in a cockpit like this? Different aircraft, different crisis, but the same weight of responsibility. The same knowledge that people she'd never meet were depending on her to make the impossible possible. James returned from checking the cabin. Everyone's out. A few minor injuries from the evacuation, but nothing serious. He paused, studying her. "You've been in situations like this before, combat situations." It wasn't a question. Rebecca nodded. "Different theater, same stakes. Lives on the line, systems failing, physics as your enemy and ally." "Your call sign," the captain said suddenly. "You said people call you Phantom. There's a story there." Rebecca smiled, a real smile this time. "Afghanistan, 2008. 6 enemy fighters had me boxed in. I disappeared into a canyon system. They thought they'd shot me down. I came up behind them instead. Got 2 before they realized their ghost was real." She stood, gathering her jacket. "But that feels like someone else's life now. I retired 18 months ago." This was supposed to be a quiet flight to a medical conference. "Retired," the captain repeated. Yet you just flew my aircraft better than I could have without any hydraulics to a dead stick landing on an abandoned runway." He extended his hand. "Captain Robert Hayes, it's been an honor, Major." She shook his hand, then James's. "The honor was mine. You both kept your heads when most pilots would have panicked. That's what saved these people, not me, but all of us working together." As she climbed down the emergency slide, Rebecca heard the first news helicopters approaching. By morning, this would be everywhere. The miracle landing, the heroic pilots, the mysterious fighter pilot who appeared from row 10. They'd want interviews, photographs, the whole media circus. But for now, in the darkness of this abandoned base, she was just another survivor walking away from an aircraft that should have crashed. Her phone, miraculously, had signal. 1 bar, but enough. She typed a text to her daughter. "Landing delayed but safe. Interesting flight. Love you more than all the stars we used to count." She hit send before adding what she really wanted to say, that she'd almost died tonight, that every ignored bedtime story and missed recital had flashed through her mind, that redemption sometimes came in unexpected forms at 37,000 feet. A young mother with 2 children approached her. "You're the pilot," she said, "the fighter pilot who saved us." Her children, maybe 6 and 8, stared up at Rebecca with wide eyes. "Are you a superhero?" the younger one asked. Rebecca knelt down to their level. "No, sweetheart, just someone who learned to fly a long time ago. But you know what? Your mom's the superhero, keeping you both calm and safe during all that." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "My husband's deployed, Navy. He's going to—" She stopped, overwhelmed. Rebecca understood. The unfinished sentence held everything: relief that she'd survived to see him again, that their children wouldn't grow up with folded flags instead of parents. "He's going to be proud of how brave you all were," Rebecca finished for her. Standing, she noticed other passengers watching her. Some nodded respect, some whispered among themselves, but none approached. She preferred it that way. In combat, she'd learned to compartmentalize. Mission first, emotions later, usually alone with a bottle of whiskey and memories that wouldn't stay buried. Tonight would be no different, except the ghosts would be of lives saved rather than lives taken. Military vehicles were arriving now, setting up a temporary command post. A full colonel approached. Army, not Air Force, but brass was brass. "Major Voss, I'm Colonel Patterson. Hell of a thing you did tonight. We've got transport arranged for the passengers, but I'd like to debrief you first if you're up for it." "Of course, sir." She fell back into military bearing without thinking, shoulders back, chin up, the familiar comfort of protocol. As they walked toward the command vehicle, she heard him say quietly, "I knew your father, flew with him in Desert Storm. He'd have been proud tonight." The words stopped her cold. Her father had been dead 5 years, but his shadow still shaped her sky. "You knew him?" Patterson nodded. "Saved my ass over Baghdad. Said the only thing he feared was his daughter becoming a better pilot than him." He smiled. "Guess that fear was justified." The debrief was thorough but quick, military efficiency at its finest. She drew diagrams of the hydraulic failures, explained her decision-making process, credited the commercial pilots for their adaptability. Patterson took notes, occasionally shaking his head in amazement. "Using differential thrust to steer. That's some old-school flying, Major. The kind they can't teach in simulators." "Everything can't be taught, sir. Sometimes you have to learn by having no other choice." She accepted the coffee someone offered, black, strong, terrible, perfect. "Those pilots tonight, Hayes and Mitchell, they performed beyond their training. Make sure that gets noted. This wasn't a solo performance." "Understood, but you were the conductor of this particular orchestra." He closed his notebook. "There's going to be media attention. Lots of it. You ready for that?" Rebecca shrugged. "I spent 20 years avoiding attention, sir, old habits." But she knew it was inevitable. By tomorrow, her face would be on every news channel, her service record scrutinized, her past dissected. The quiet retirement she'd sought was over. A bus arrived for the last group of passengers. Rebecca watched them board, ordinary people who'd faced extraordinary circumstances and survived. Tomorrow they'd have stories to tell, exaggerations that would grow with each telling. The turbulence would become worse, the landing more dramatic, the danger more imminent. But tonight they were just grateful to be alive, and that was enough. "Major," a voice from behind. She turned to find James, the co-pilot, still in his uniform but looking years older than he had 6 hours ago. "I wanted to ask, how do you do it? Stay so calm when everything's falling apart." Rebecca considered the question. "You assume I was calm. My heart rate was probably higher than yours, but panic is a luxury you can't afford when people are counting on you. So you push it down, deal with it later." Does it get easier? She thought of nights she'd woken screaming, of marriages that couldn't survive the weight of secrets, of the therapist who'd finally helped her understand that strength wasn't the absence of fear but action despite it. No, but you get better at pretending it does. Her phone buzzed, a text from her daughter. "Mom, what do you mean interesting flight? Are you okay?" Then another, "Wait, is this you on the news? Mom," and another, "They're saying you landed a plane with no hydraulics. Call ME." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd felt all night. She dialed and her daughter answered before the first ring finished. "Mom, oh my God, are you okay? The news is saying." "I'm fine, sweetheart, everyone's fine." She could hear her daughter crying, that particular mix of fear and relief that came with near misses. "But Mom, they're saying you're a hero, that you saved 400 people." "I did my job, the job I was trained for, even if it was in a different context." She paused, then added what she'd wanted to say for years. "I'm sorry, baby, for all the times the job came first, for all the times I chose the sky over you." "Mom, no." Her daughter's voice was firm through the tears. "I wasn't angry because you were gone. I was angry because I was scared you wouldn't come back. But tonight 400 people get to go home because you were who you are, because you chose the sky all those times and learned things that saved them." The forgiveness in those words was almost unbearable. Rebecca walked away from the others, needing privacy for the emotions threatening to overwhelm her professional composure. "I love you," she managed. "So much. More than flying, more than anything." They talked for a few more minutes, her daughter filling her in on the media coverage, the social media explosion, the interview requests already flooding in. Rebecca half listened, still processing the night's events. After hanging up, she stood alone in the darkness beyond the emergency lights. The abandoned runway stretched behind her, scarred with rubber from their landing. Above, stars emerged between dissipating clouds, the same stars she'd navigated by in combat, the same stars she'd taught her daughter to name during the brief periods between deployments. The sky had been her first love, her constant companion, her refuge, and her battlefield. Tonight, it had tested her one more time. "Major Voss," Colonel Patterson approached with a satellite phone. "SecDef wants to speak with you." The Secretary of Defense. Rebecca almost laughed. From row 10 to the Pentagon's attention in one night. She took the phone, straightened her shoulders, and accepted one more mission, this time as the reluctant face of a miracle she'd helped engineer. The conversation was brief but meaningful. Commendations would follow, the secretary assured her. A return to service if she wanted it, consultant positions, training development, anything. Rebecca thanked him but made no commitments. She'd learned long ago that adrenaline made poor decisions. Tomorrow, in the calm light of day, she'd think about the future. Tonight, she just wanted to process the fact that she'd touched the controls of an aircraft one more time and brought everyone home. Dawn was breaking as the last helicopter prepared to leave. Rebecca would be on it, bound for Halifax and then a commercial flight home, this time as a passenger who'd never look at flying the same way. Captain Hayes and James were on the same helicopter, still in their uniforms, still processing the night. As they lifted off, Rebecca looked back at the abandoned runway one last time. It would be famous now, this forgotten strip of concrete. Television crews would film here, investigators would measure and photograph, pilots would study what happened. But for her, it would always be something simpler, the place where 20 years of training met one impossible moment and won. "You know," Captain Hayes said over the helicopter's noise, "I've been thinking about retiring. Tonight was," he trailed off, unable to finish. Rebecca understood. When you touched the edge of disaster and survived, normal flying seemed either mundane or terrifying. There was no middle ground. Give it time, she advised. The shakiness fades, the confidence returns, but it's okay if it doesn't. It's okay to walk away. Is that what you did, walked away? She nodded. After my last combat deployment, I realized I was flying on autopilot, no pun intended, going through the motions but not feeling it anymore. That's dangerous in a fighter jet. So I retired, tried to be a normal person. She smiled wryly. Turns out normal is relative. James spoke up. Would you come back? To service, I mean. Rebecca considered it. 6 months ago, I'd have said never. Now, I don't know. Tonight reminded me that the skills we earn through sacrifice don't just disappear. They wait. They wait for moments when they matter. The helicopter banked toward Halifax, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Below, the wilderness of Nova Scotia stretched endless and peaceful. Somewhere behind them, investigators were already arriving at the abandoned base, beginning the process of understanding what had happened. They'd analyze the hydraulic failures, study the unconventional landing, create new procedures based on the night's events. But they'd never fully capture the weight of those minutes when physics and fear fought for dominance, and 3 pilots refused to let either win. Rebecca's phone had signal again. Messages poured in, former squadron mates who'd recognized her name on the news, friends from her civilian life shocked to learn about her military past, reporters offering astronomical sums for exclusive interviews. She deleted the media requests without reading them. The others she'd answer later when she had words for what had happened. For now, she simply sent one more text to her daughter. On my way home. We have a lot to talk about. Good things, I promise. The Halifax airport was chaos. News crews, emergency responders, airline officials, and hundreds of family members who'd heard about the near disaster. Rebecca pulled her jacket's hood up and tried to blend into the crowd of passengers, but a young reporter spotted her. Major Voss, can you tell us what happened up there? The microphone thrust at her face felt more threatening than any missile lock she'd ever experienced. No comment, she said firmly, pushing past. But more reporters appeared, forming a wall of cameras and questions. Is it true you flew combat missions in Afghanistan? How did you know what to do? Were you scared? The last question from a very young journalist made her pause. Everyone was scared, she said simply. Fear is human, but we did our jobs anyway. Captain Hayes, First Officer Mitchell, the cabin crew, even the passengers, everyone did what they needed to do. That's the story. Not one person, but 400 people choosing to survive together. She pushed through before they could ask more, finding refuge in an airline lounge where officials waited with paperwork, tickets home, and thankfully, silence. Captain Hayes was there, already changed into civilian clothes, looking older